Tensions between China and the United States just hit a boiling point, and this latest move could shake the foundation of American industries. In a bold and unexpected strike, China has cut off a critical supply chain lifeline that the U.S. heavily depends on, sending shockwaves through major industries like technology, defense, and manufacturing. Without these essential resources, America's economic stability hangs in the balance. What exactly did China do, and how will this affect everyday life? Let's dive into the shocking details. U.S.-China trade war. What started as a simple trade dispute quickly became a global power struggle, reshaping economic alliances and shifting the balance of influence. It all began in February when the United States announced a massive $60 billion in tariffs, aiming to boost its own manufacturing industries. Sectors like technology, electric vehicles, and raw materials, industries vital to the American economy. This move wasn't just about trade. It was part of a much bigger strategy to challenge China's trade practices on a fundamental level. However, China saw this as more than just an economic challenge. It was a direct political and financial threat. In response, they hit back with $35 billion in counter tariffs, carefully choosing industries that would put pressure on American policymakers. The strategy was deliberate. They targeted farming, energy, and other politically sensitive sectors. Midwestern soybean farmers and Texas oil producers suddenly found themselves at the center of an escalating economic conflict. The impact was immediate. U.S. industries that relied on exports to China began lobbying against these tariff policies, urging the government to reconsider. But China's response wasn't just about immediate retaliation. They had a long-term game plan. Instead of depending on U.S. trade, they began forging stronger economic partnerships across the globe. Countries like Russia, Brazil, and Mexico became key allies, signing new trade deals that allowed China to reduce its reliance on American goods. This wasn't just a quick fix. It was a calculated move to build an independent economic network, one that could function without U.S. influence. One of China's most powerful strategic advantages lay in its control of rare earth minerals, essential components for technology, electric vehicles, and even military defense. Since China controls nearly 80% of the global supply, they had the power to disrupt entire industries. Subtly but effectively, they hinted at restricting exports to the U.S., sending a clear message. If tensions escalated, American industries could suffer deeply. China also took aim at another key sector, energy. By imposing steep tariffs on U.S. oil and liquefied natural gas, they struck a major blow to American energy companies. Almost overnight, U.S. energy exports faced losses, contracts were canceled, and profits plummeted. But China didn't just stop at tariffs. They also ramped up efforts to secure energy independence. Massive deals were signed with Russia and Middle Eastern countries, and domestic production was expanded, reducing China's reliance on American energy imports altogether. Even if tariffs were lifted in the future, these new partnerships were likely to remain in place, permanently reshaping the global energy market. What started as a battle over trade turned into something much bigger. China wasn't just reacting, it was rebuilding its economic relationships and securing its position on the world stage. This shift weakened U.S. dominance in key industries and signaled a new era in global trade where power wasn't dictated by one country alone. Instead of waiting for the U.S. to change course, China made its own path, one that would ensure its economic resilience for decades to come. How can the U.S. reduce its dependence on Chinese supply chains and secure its own resources and maintain technological lead? Let's continue exploring to find out. The race for technological dominance. The U.S. imposed strict trade restrictions on Chinese technology, blocking exports of advanced computer chips and other essential tech components. The goal was to slow down China's progress in cutting-edge industries like artificial intelligence, 5G, and semiconductor production. However, instead of weakening, China responded with massive investments in its own technology sector. Rather than relying on foreign suppliers, China poured billions into developing its own advanced chips, AI systems, and telecommunications networks. The results were impressive. China's tech industry didn't just survive, it thrived. Chinese companies are now producing high-tech products that compete globally, challenging American firms' long-standing dominance. But this trade dispute isn't just about business. It's a battle for leadership in global innovation. By being forced to rely on itself, China accelerated its technological independence, reducing U.S. influence over key industries. This shift has created a major long-term challenge for the United States, as China closes the gap in fields where America once held an undisputed lead. Beyond the trade war, China wields another powerful economic tool: its massive holdings of U.S. debt. China owns about $800 billion in the U.S. Treasury bonds, which gives it quiet but significant influence over American finances. Instead of making drastic moves, China has taken a more subtle approach, reducing its purchases of U.S. debt. This seemingly small shift had widespread effects. With China buying fewer U.S. bonds, borrowing costs in the U.S. went up, causing interest rates on everything from mortgages to car loans to rise. Many Americans felt the financial strain, revealing just how interconnected the two economies are. This wasn't an act of retaliation. It was a calculated strategy that highlighted America's financial vulnerabilities. China's new trade alliances. As the U.S. tightened restrictions, China looked elsewhere, forming new trade partnerships around the world. It strengthened economic ties with Southeast Asia, Europe, and Latin America, reducing its dependence on American goods. But China's strategy wasn't just about replacing lost business. It was about reshaping global trade in a way that made the U.S. less relevant. By building independent trade networks, China weakened America's influence in international markets. For U.S. businesses, this meant losing access to markets they had dominated for decades. The trade war forced companies to rethink where and how they manufacture goods. U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports made production more expensive, and businesses had to find alternatives. Anticipating this shift, China built strong partnerships with developing nations like Vietnam, Indonesia, and parts of Africa, turning them into key suppliers. This move permanently changed global supply chains. American companies that relied on cheap Chinese manufacturing suddenly had to pay more to relocate production elsewhere. Meanwhile, China's strategy strengthened its relationships with emerging economies, securing long-term trade advantages. For the global economy, this was a game-changing moment. The old ways of producing and distributing goods were disrupted, and new trade patterns emerged, ones where China played a central role. One of the hardest-hit groups in the U.S. was farmers. Before the trade war, China was a major buyer of American agricultural products, especially soybeans, corn, and pork. But when tariffs escalated, China dramatically cut back on U.S. imports and turned to countries like Brazil and Argentina for its food supply. This sudden shift left American farmers struggling with unsold crops and plummeting prices. Many faced rising debts and financial uncertainty. To help, the U.S. government provided bailout money, but these payments were only a temporary fix. If China permanently relies on new suppliers, American farmers could suffer long-term economic damage. This crisis also had political consequences. Many farming communities, which are key voting regions, became frustrated with the trade war's impact. Their struggles have influenced political decisions and intensified the debate over U.S.-China economic policies. The U.S.-China trade war was supposed to weaken China's tech industry and economic power. Instead, it fueled China's push for self-reliance, strengthened its global trade alliances, and exposed vulnerabilities in the U.S. economy. China's bold strategy. Trade wars aren't just battles between governments. They have real, everyday consequences for people around the world. When China made strategic economic moves, it triggered massive changes in global markets, affecting businesses, consumers, and entire economies in ways most people never saw coming. Many people think trade wars only impact big corporations, but in reality, they hit ordinary consumers the hardest. When tariffs are imposed, the cost of importing goods goes up, forcing businesses to raise prices. That means higher prices for essentials like smartphones, clothing, and even groceries. What most consumers don't realize is that these extra costs act like a hidden tax, quietly draining their wallets. For example, if a smartphone relies on Chinese components, a tariff makes those parts more expensive, which increases the overall price of the phone. The same applies to food and agricultural products imported from China. Supermarket prices go up, but few people understand why. Families end up paying more for everyday necessities without realizing that international trade policies are behind it. This financial strain isn't just an inconvenience. It alters household budgets, limits spending power, and creates frustration. And unlike regular taxes, there's no clear explanation for why prices are rising. It just happens, leaving families to bear the burden. The impact of the U.S.-China trade war wasn't limited to just those two countries. It sent shockwaves through financial markets worldwide. Every time new tariffs were announced, stock markets reacted with sudden drops in uncertainty. Big companies that rely on global trade, especially in the tech and automotive industries, saw their stock prices swing wildly. Investors worried about how tariffs would hurt business profits, leading to a ripple effect that extended far beyond Wall Street. People with retirement accounts, pensions, and personal investments saw their savings fluctuate as a result. For many, this instability meant one thing: less financial security for the future. Market volatility, fueled by trade tensions, made it difficult for investors and businesses alike to plan. The long-term consequences of this economic uncertainty continue to shape global investment strategies. While the US and China were at the center of the trade war, many other nations felt the impact too. Countries in Southeast Asia, which depend on trade with both economic giants, struggled with disrupted supply chains. European businesses, which rely on smooth global imports, faced unexpected cost increases. Developing nations that supply raw materials to China also felt the squeeze. When China's demand for resources dropped, industries in those countries suffered, leading to economic slowdowns. Smaller nations that relied on stable trade partnerships suddenly found themselves struggling to adapt to the new reality. Even if the US and China managed to settle their trade disputes, the damage has already been done. Business relationships have been strained, trust has been broken, and companies are rethinking their long-term strategies. China, in particular, has been focused on becoming less reliant on the US. By investing heavily in its own industries, strengthening alliances with other nations, and expanding its leadership in global markets, China is positioning itself as an independent powerhouse. Meanwhile, the US faces a new challenge: maintaining its global influence while dealing with tougher competition. The balance of economic power is shifting, and the world is watching closely to see what happens next. The real question isn't whether the trade war will end. It's what the world will look like after it. Global supply chains have been permanently reshaped, and the next chapter of economic power is already being written. Will the US reclaim its dominance, or will China quietly take the lead? Let's explore further. Impact of the trade war. The trade war between the US and China has reshaped global business in ways no one could have predicted. For decades, the US and many other countries depended heavily on China for manufacturing. China had built itself into the world's production powerhouse, making goods quickly and efficiently. However, when tariffs increased and tensions escalated, businesses were forced to rethink their strategies. Many companies quickly shifted their operations to places like Vietnam and Indonesia, looking for cheaper alternatives. But China was already one step ahead. It had already invested in these same regions, setting up new supply chains that didn't rely on the US at all. At the same time, China deepened its relationships with African nations, securing access to raw materials and a steady labor force. While US businesses struggled with the high costs of moving production, China took a long-term approach. It diversified its supply chain while still maintaining dominance in global manufacturing. The effects of the trade war are now permanent. How goods are made and moved around the world has changed for good. One of the hardest hit groups in this trade war was American farmers. Before the tariffs, China was the biggest buyer of US agricultural goods like soybeans, corn, and pork. But once China imposed its own restrictions, those exports plummeted. Suddenly, American farmers had massive surpluses of crops, but no one to buy them. Meanwhile, countries like Brazil and Argentina jumped in to take America's place, supplying China with food at competitive prices. To help struggling farmers, the US government issued bailout packages. But these were only temporary solutions, not long-term fixes. Even if the tariffs were lifted today, there's no guarantee that China would return to American suppliers. The new trade relationships China has built are strong, and for many US farmers, this means continued financial uncertainty. Entire rural communities that depend on agriculture are feeling the pressure, and they are demanding lasting solutions, not short-term financial aid. The effects of the trade war aren't just being felt by businesses and farmers. Everyday consumers are also taking a financial hit, often without realizing it. When tariffs make it more expensive for businesses to import goods, those extra costs get passed down to customers. Electronics, clothing, and household items that used to be affordable now come with much higher price tags. For example, smartphones that rely on Chinese-made parts have become more expensive. Even grocery store items that were once cheap to import have risen in cost. This acts like an invisible tax on consumers, making family budgets tighter. Most people don't even realize that global trade tensions are the reason they're paying more at the checkout counter. Beyond just the immediate financial burden, this uncertainty also shakes consumer confidence. When people aren't sure about the economy, they tend to spend less, which can slow down businesses and lead to job losses. The impact of the trade war extends far beyond just tariffs. It's influencing the entire economic mood of the country, the ripple effect on global markets. Financial markets worldwide have been rocked by the uncertainty of this trade war. Every time a new tariff was announced or negotiations between the US and China broke down, stock markets fluctuated wildly. Tech companies, car manufacturers, and multinational corporations saw their stock prices drop sharply, worrying investors about the long-term consequences. For everyday Americans, this meant that their retirement savings, pensions, and investment accounts took major hits. The instability made it difficult for businesses to plan ahead, as they weren't sure what new trade restrictions might come next. Companies that rely on international trade face mounting risks, making economic instability the new normal. The impact of this trade war hasn't just been limited to the US and China. It has sent shockwaves across the global economy. Countries that do business with both nations have faced serious challenges. In Southeast Asia, supply chains have been thrown into chaos. European businesses have been forced to pay higher prices when importing goods from either the US or China. Developing nations that supply raw materials to China have struggled because Chinese demand has dropped. Economies in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East have all felt the pressure, as uncertainty in global trade has made growth much harder. This conflict has exposed just how interconnected the world's economies truly are. When two major powers like the US and China clash, the consequences ripple across the entire planet. Global economic growth has slowed, operating costs have risen, and smaller economies are struggling to keep up. This trade conflict offered critical insights into how nations must navigate economic competition. One of the biggest takeaways was the importance of diversifying trade partnerships and supply chains. Countries that depended too much on a single nation for imports or exports found themselves at greater risk when tensions escalated. China, recognizing this vulnerability, used the trade war as an opportunity to strengthen its economic independence. It rapidly expanded its network of global trade partners, developed alternative supply chains, and reduced its reliance on US industries. Meanwhile, the US faced the challenge of maintaining its economic influence amid growing competition. The conflict underscored how economic battles are no longer just about tariffs. They're about long-term control of global markets and systems. The trade war revealed how quickly the balance of power in the world economy can shift. Nations are no longer just reacting to disputes. They are actively positioning themselves to control key industries and trade routes for decades to come. Businesses worldwide learned a hard lesson. Resilience and adaptability are no longer optional but necessary for survival. While the US and China were locked in conflict, developing nations found new opportunities. China redirected its focus toward these regions, offering investments and forming trade partnerships. Countries in Africa and Southeast Asia benefited from increased Chinese funding, helping them develop their industries and infrastructure. Will America find new ways to maintain its leadership in trade and technology? Or will it struggle to keep pace with an increasingly self-sufficient China? Let's find out. Future of US-China relations. Even with negotiations and new trade deals, trust between the US and China has been severely damaged. Trade wars are easy to start, but incredibly difficult to resolve completely. China remains focused on reducing its dependence on American industries, instead investing heavily in domestic production and strengthening economic ties with other nations. Both nations now face a critical decision. Will they work together to find a peaceful solution, or will competition continue to escalate? The choices they make today will influence the world economy for generations to come. What happens next could redefine how businesses operate, how countries trade, and even how global leadership is determined. One of China's most powerful tools in this trade conflict is something most people don't think about: rare earth minerals. These minerals are essential for making modern technology, including smartphones, electric cars, and even military equipment. China controls more than 80% of the global supply, During the trade war, China subtly hinted that it could limit the export of these crucial materials. It wasn't an open threat, but a well-calculated move that sent shockwaves through industries worldwide. If the US lost access to these minerals, American companies would struggle to manufacture advanced technology. This situation highlights a major weakness in global supply chains. China isn't just using rare earths as leverage, it's also ensuring its own security by keeping control over these valuable resources. What do you think about China's surprising decision on the United States? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe.